Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's virtual discussion about climate, energy, and the environment during Germany's G7 presidency. This event is part of a virtual series that is being organized by the American Council on Germany and the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. to highlight the issues on the G7 agenda this year. Under the climate and environment track during Germany's G7 presidency, environment, climate, and energy ministers from G7 countries have pursued several goals. These have included the accelerated global phase out of coal, the forced decarbonization of certain sectors, and the systemic transition toward environmental sustainability in all areas of life, as well as initiatives to protect the ocean. This work builds on previous G7 agendas, which include the sustainable use of resources, adapting to the impact of the climate crisis, and the development of environmentally sustainable supply chains. This is a very timely event for us to hold because it comes just a few weeks after COP27 and as Germany's G7 presidency draws to a close. I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Jennifer Morgan. She is joining us from Berlin, where she serves as State Secretary and Special Envoy for International Climate Action in the German Foreign Office. And prior to that, served as Executive Director of Greenpeace International. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Sure thing. Good to be here with you. Thanks.
I am hoping that Jonathan Pershing from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation will join us momentarily. But if he does not, I'm sure that we can have an interesting and productive conversation zu zweit, right? Just the two of us. And I thought that maybe I could start by asking you to talk a little bit about Germany's G7 priorities when it comes to climate, energy, and the environment, because my guess is at the beginning of the year, when you were looking ahead to this year of Germany's G7 presidency, the priorities might have been a little bit different from what they ended up being following Russia's war in Ukraine, and how that might have sort of upset some of the priorities.
Yeah, well, thanks again for the opportunity to be with you. I think it's amazing that the year and the G7 presidency is drawing to a close. It's been quite a year. And I guess what I would say is that I don't think the Russian war of aggression actually, it shifted the focus. I think it really added to it. Germany already had planned on having climate and energy, the transformation to a renewable energy economy and circular economy, those issues be part of the agenda. But once the Russian war of aggression came, it became even clearer how important it was to phase out of fossil fuels, particularly, of course, Russian fossil fuels to start with, but all as quickly as possible, and really strengthen the focus on energy security and the interconnectedness between energy security, climate change, and peace. And so what I think you saw was in fact, an opening there for an acceleration of the transition to renewables and energy efficiency while phasing out Russian fossil fuels. And so you saw over a short time period during the G7 presidency, a massive legislative package by Germany to scale up our renewable energy to 80% by 2030 in the power sector. Continued focus on phasing out coal, aiming still for 2030. And I think, we really had to look at it in perhaps three different time frames or three major areas. In the short term, obviously, now I'm kind of getting more into it. I see Jonathan has joined, so maybe I'll pause for a second and then.
Well, I'd say actually, why don't you continue with those three threads, and then we'll bring Jonathan into the conversation.
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, I think what we really have been working on to manage the current energy crisis caused by the Russian aggression, first is really in the short term, particularly for this winter and the coming winter, we're working to obviously to ensure our energy security of fossil fuel supplies, gas in particular. I think the thing to remember, which sometimes gets forgotten, is if you no longer have access or have decided to phase out 55% of your gas supply, you need to replace them. So that's why you've seen us on the world market working with Norway, working with the Netherlands to replace that, as well as really at the same time phasing out those Russian imports. And I think we've made great progress in this year in achieving it. We're no longer importing coal and gas from Russia to Germany, and only marginal amounts of oil right now, which will equally phase out by the end of this year. So that's been kind of number one. Number two has been to manage energy prices and also to really contain the social impact, given that the prices are abnormally very high at the moment. And there's been a number of measures on the German, the national level, but also the European level that have been agreed upon, legislative actions that have assisted in that. And that has been a very big priority also for us and for the whole European Union. And third is what I started with, which is in parallel, really accelerating and most importantly, kind of urgently, the energy transition away from fossil fuels at the European level and at the national level towards climate neutrality. We think that this is really the most sustainable recipe for addressing all of these crises that we face right now, and whether it be the energy security crisis or the energy price crisis, and of course the climate crisis. So I think this geopolitical crisis is a very strong signal to push ahead with the global energy transition to renewable energy, and even more forcefully than before February 24th. So in a way, what you saw through the year was the G7 coming together, I think, in the European Union first, of course, and then also the G7, and being very clear that that is the pathway that we are on, and working to make our economies much less dependent on fossil fuels. Thanks.
So thank you for setting the stage for us. And I would like to welcome Dr. Jonathan Pershing with us. He's Program Director of the Environment at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Before that, he served as one of the staff members for Special Envoy John Kerry. And so what's great about having both of you with us today is you both have government service, but you've also both been with important nonprofit organizations and civic society organizations working on these issues around energy, the environment, and climate. And so, Jonathan, I'd like to bring you in by asking you to talk a little bit about some of the challenges inherent with being energy independent in the interconnected environment that Jennifer Morgan was just talking about.
Great. Well, thanks, Steve. Good to see you. And Jennifer, great to see you as well. Thanks for those framing comments. I think they really set the stage for one of the most central questions that we're all grappling with. Let me come back just to say a couple of things in context, and then maybe directly speak to the question. So we've got a number of parallel crises that we're all working on. And I think it's actually extremely difficult to divide them out and say, well, this is the important one and the other one is less. And I just want to make explicit what they are. We clearly have a climate crisis, and Jennifer, noted this and framed this. It's not an accident that countries have decided to try to marry up their agendas because they see these in parallel as being pressing. But we also have an energy supply security problem. And that's been compounded by a problem around some of the interconnectedness of the markets in terms of the alternatives, as well as the conventional fuels are tied to supplies that are often not available in country. Doesn't matter what country you're from. It doesn't matter if the United States, which is quite large, or Europe, which collectively is quite substantial, or even China, which has huge assets. None of us are able to do this on our own. And so there's going to be this interdependence and connection that we have to manage. But so we've got a supply constraint. That's been compounded in these last months, very better part of a year, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that has led to a series of other constraints, dominated by constraints around fossil fuel. But we should be clear, Russia is also a supplier of some of the other commodities that are required for the new energy system. So it's going to be a much more complicated framework. That's been compounded by COVID. And the COVID dynamics have changed supply chains, not least in China, but also disrupted ability to move goods and services around the world. So all of these come together. So as we look at solving the problems, it is not going to be sufficient to really take a single isolated strand and pull it out. We have to think about this jointly. I think there are a number of solutions. One of them certainly gets into more localization, which leads to a degree of competition. And we're starting to see that. We're seeing that for many of the major players. We certainly see it from the United States as it pushes on a domestic bill that is in no small measure designed around both jobs and competition and climate. So it's not one or the other. We see it in Europe collectively. We see dimensions around security of supply at home in almost all cases. The US, which has enormous reserves of natural gas, has not dismissed that as a medium-term option, but it's also simultaneously working on a massive program for renewables and scaling up efficiency and looking at alternative supply chains. India is doing the same thing, right? We've got a massive commitment on the Indian side to take these big investments forward. China is doing the same thing. So we're kind of seeing a world in transition in the energy space. I would make one final point, Stephen, that speaks to the question. I think there's no model in which you get there without public buy-in. It doesn't matter if you're an authoritarian government or you're a democratic government. In both cases, it is a commitment from the community to move that enables this kind of transition to occur. And you see it really everywhere. And what you equally see everywhere is an increasing buy-in to the transition. So where you used to have incredible opposition to things like renewables, that's now widely assumed to be lower cost and more reliable. I look in the case, particularly of the United States, you had massive storms. Actually, the coal and the gas facilities went out. The renewable solar plants stayed running and were quickly put back online, even when other systems had disastrous consequences. So for me, these kinds of transitions and these kinds of social buy-ins are shifting, and the price makes it more palatable. And the question now is rate. And that's where Germany's solutions that Jennifer's laid out, the European-wide solutions that we are seeing, the American solutions, the incentives coming from places like Korea or Japan or now Australia, those are driving it to happen much more quickly than they would have absent that kind of government intervention.
Jennifer, you're nodding. Would you like to add something directly to what Jonathan said, or can I sort of squeeze in a question to both of you?
Go for it. You can ask a question.
So the question that I would have after listening to both of you speak is you know, both of you have put, you know, at the top of the list of issues to be addressed, the climate crisis. You've both, you know, spoken, and Jonathan, I loved how you brought some of the threads together, but you've both talked about the fact that, you know, this crisis cannot be looked at in isolation because there are a number of other interconnected issues that need to be taken into account. And I guess the sort of fundamental question I would have for each of you is, are you seeing a greater recognition that we are facing a climate crisis than you saw previously? Is there more widespread recognition and appreciation of what is coming down the pike toward us?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I think what's happened in the last months in many countries around the world, I think whether it be the rivers in Germany and China that couldn't deliver anymore because of the low levels, whether it be the droughts that have been seen. I'm just back from two weeks in South America, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, where it's clearly a top priority, also in the incoming Lula administration, because they see that it is an issue that cuts across everything, whether it be the impacts of, on food security for people, whether it be impacts on the energy system in order to deliver energy services. It's really about the real economy. It's about people. So my answer would be yes. It doesn't mean that it's all moving as quickly as it should, but I think I definitely see this much deeper appreciation for how serious the situation is.
I just add two things to Jennifer's frame because I think she's completely correct. And just by way of a couple of examples, we're beginning to see events at a scale we've never seen before, and they are globally spread. So it's not as if there's one place that sees them. I've been working on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for quite a number of years, since its inception in the late 1980s. And when we first began, we projected these damages. We thought they'd be between 2030 and 2050. As the world has continued to increase its emissions, we've moved the timetable forward, and they're now visible. What are those things? It is flooding in Pakistan, which displaces 30 million people. When we start thinking about the consequences of individual events, we think about things like the Syrian refugee crisis. That's measured in less than 10 million people. Even Ukraine is in the 10 million person range. One event, a flood that was deemed much more likely because of climate change, 30 million people. Wildfire has spread rampantly across the Western United States. It's also spread across the entirety of Russia. It's also found across Australia, a scale we've never seen before. Floods and then droughts at the other end of the extreme, some that we've seen experiencing in central China at a scale we've not seen before. In parts of the United States, it's a drought that people think hasn't occurred for over 1,000 years. So we're looking at things that are clearly climate-induced and not at a scale that's inconvenient, but at a scale that is life-threatening, a scale that is institutionally destabilizing. And so I think the consequence of that has manifest in how it shows up in governments and in policy. I don't think it's an accident that over 100 heads of state showed up at Sharm el-Sheikh. They came because the agenda is now relevant at that level. I don't think it's an accident it's on the agenda of the G20 or the G7 or bilateral conversation between President Biden and President Xi. To me, that is a manifestation of the kinds of consequences that we are now observing, as opposed to only thinking might show up for our grandchildren.
Mm-hmm. So one of our viewers has a question that ties in with exactly this, and he writes, there are people in governments out there that are climate deniers. What do they think is causing all of the weather-related problems that you've been talking about, if not climate change? And I guess I would add to that, how do you and your work deal with those climate change deniers and try to convince them that this is actually something to be taken seriously because of global warming and because of climate change?
Maybe I'll start with this one and just say a couple of quick things. There are also people today who believe the Earth is flat. I'm not convinced that we work as that with our primary hypothesis. I think instead what we want to do is think about how we solve the problem and how we maximize benefit for the largest number of people in doing so. So I think there are a number of very clear directions of travel. The first is the straight up science. That has not been questioned for several decades. It is not an issue that we're debating any longer. What we are debating is how to address it, how to minimize the consequences of the transition. Because transitions are disruptive, transitions are change, and there's a status quo that you're trying to move away from. So we have to manage that. That's about workforce, that's about technology, that's about price to the consumer. So I think what we're seeing in government is an exercise not to address the deniers, but to address the transition in a way that minimizes those risks to people around the world.
I don't have too much to add to that. I completely agree. And I think it's really working to balance the social issues along with the environment and to move forward with benefits to as many as possible. I mean, and the situation is so dire that I don't hear really much discussion about it not happening. It's about what do we do about it now?
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, of course, brought up the myriad crises that we are facing, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which thankfully, we're putting slowly but surely into the rearview mirror, but which still exists. And I certainly had a sense, as we were in the height of things dealing with the pandemic, that there could be some lessons drawn from how we responded to the pandemic that could be applied to dealing with the climate crisis. And I'm not sure at this point that that sense of optimism and sort of that we could learn from one crisis and apply it to another crisis is actually happening. I'd be curious to hear from each of you whether you think there are some tangible lessons from the COVID-19 crisis that can actually be applied to how we deal with a very different but another global challenge. Jonathan, you were sort of nodding your head as I was speaking, so let me let you go first.
So I think there are a handful of things that we clearly can and actually have learned. And let me kind of tick them off. The first one is that robust science makes a difference. If we think about the kinds of things we did successfully in COVID and the rate at which we developed a vaccine and the rate at which the vaccine was rolled out, and the kinds of credence given to our leaders in the health community to advise us on good practice. It doesn't mean we were perfect. It means that by doing that, we substantially reduced the number of deaths. And the more we followed the good guidance, the fewer the deaths we had. The second thing to note is that it didn't happen all at once. The vaccine development was built on a period of several decades of earlier work, retrovirals, discussions on biotech, whole investments made by government. So you can't just start from scratch. Both of those are legitimate and connected to climate. We've been working on the science, we understand it, we understand the solutions, it's been decades in the making, now we can roll it out. The second thing which I think is relevant is the scale of government intervention. This is not something that happens because the private sector volunteers it to happen. It happens because governments and people collectively engage. And that means governments at all levels. We didn't just see national governments stepping up. We saw the WHO at the multinational level, the multilateral level. We saw individual communities at a local level rolling out capacity. We saw programs in our academic communities trying to build a more rapid pipeline. So all of that, a lesson. A third lesson that we've got is this was a public-private endeavor. This was not done exclusively by government. It was done in partnership. And we saw those kinds of partnerships with companies really stepping in. And I don't just mean healthcare companies or biotech companies. I mean hospitals. I mean communities, logistics management. I mean companies that managed how they dealt with workforce and training. So that whole set of lessons is global, not just national. And then finally, I would say that one of the things that COVID gave us was a sense that we can tackle big problems. We actually had many fewer deaths than you might have projected from a pandemic of this scale. And I don't want to minimize the deaths that the US had. They were enormous. But the deaths that we're going to see from climate are probably scaled in the same fashion, if not larger. We can solve problems like this. And I think one of the things that COVID gave us was a real sense that these kinds of massive events are not beyond our ability to influence and minimize. And I think that's also a critical lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with all of those. I mean, I think if the decision makers had been listening to the scientists as they did during COVID, we would be further along on the climate piece. But I think we can see how when you have evidence-based decision making, when you have scientists being really listened to by heads of state, by key ministers, by the public, I mean, and having was not without controversy, and that doesn't mean that the public was always with what the scientists were saying, but I think that it played a major role. I think the other couple things that I would add, maybe in the sense that we can tackle big problems, would just be the speed and scale at which it occurred. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges. We now know, I mean, we've driven down the price of renewable energy, for example. Those solutions are there. We have a good amount of the technology to get us a good way to the solutions. And so it really is a prioritization and a speed and scale issue. And I think with COVID, we saw that when the risks are really internalized and felt and understood, then solving the problem is the largest priority. And then the different societal or stakeholder views are balanced or are in the way that society as a whole benefits. So I think that was another one. And I think two others that strike me is, I think with COVID, there was also something we can bring with us, just this connection in between, nature and humans. And I think many people around the world kind of understood that connection. But then I think, although certainly Germany and the EU and other countries work to do quite a lot with sharing and sending vaccinations, et cetera, I do think that there's a real lack of trust that came from some of the applications or some of the approaches on COVID from developing countries. They just didn't feel that enough had been done, that there was a great prioritization of countries and citizens of developed countries. And now you're seeing that. Actually, we saw that at the COP as well, kind of come in, particularly in the areas of when the impacts continue to hit and countries have such debt, how they can actually now engage in the climate crisis, and both solving the climate crisis, but also dealing with the impacts to their people and the losses and the damages. So that's one where I think, maybe if that there are lessons learned there as well for all of us.
Thank you both for that. So I'd like to stick with COP27 for just a moment, because one of the criticisms after the meeting was that there was sort of a lack of ambition in addressing emissions. And I know that this was one of the G7 priorities, right? Global phase out of coal, decarbonization in some sectors. I guess the question I would have for you, Jennifer, is what more can be done to decarbonize? And then to Jonathan after that, what can civil society and philanthropy in particular do to sort of raise our ambitions, if you will, on reducing climate emissions?
Well, I think indeed, I think that was a mixed COP. I think on the one hand, it was a breakthrough for the most vulnerable countries that have been advocating for adequate attention to loss and damage for a long time. But we, the European Union, stated that we were far from satisfied with the outcome on mitigation, and that it was good that, the Glasgow outcomes were still maintained, and the 1.5 goal, and the need to be having global emissions, et cetera, and the need for all countries, each country, to come forward next year to raise their nationally determined contribution. But kind of I think the drive, actually, just as a reflection of the COP, it happened in mitigation, less on the multilateral level and more on the plurilateral and bilateral level. And there you saw, the South African Just Energy Transition Partnerships investment plan. You saw Indonesia's Just Energy Transition Partnership. Germany, we, announced a collaboration to support Kenya with its 100% renewables goal by 2030. Egypt quadrupling its renewables. So it was really, I think, there, and that's part of I think what we're working to do on that acceleration is how we can be coming together as developed countries with the range of different financial tools that we have and support to accelerate that pace and scale of change. Because I think we know what we need to do to decarbonize. We know we need to industrialize. Countries have to phase out coal by 2030. We're aiming to do that in Germany. We know that developing countries need to do that, a decade after that. And we know we need to be scaling up renewable energy and energy efficiency and building a circular economy. So I think the IPCC has given us, in many, many scientific reports, everything we need as far as what we need to do. I think there's the challenge of financing in certain countries, and that's why I think another key kind of not as visible or as recognized positive outcome of the COP was the very clear guidance that was given from the UNFCCC to, or for the parties to, the international financial institutions for reform that would make those institutions more fit for purpose and get the financing moving where it is needed. Also, we haven't talked about the land use change and forestry sectors, but absolutely essential there as well. And also really looking at the debt issues and some of the ideas and mechanisms, not just mechanisms, but programs that the International Monetary Fund are putting forward for countries. So I think, what's needed is there. I think it's a matter of partnerships across the board that really work to accelerate that pace and scale of change, that respond to the transition and the social issues that we talked about at the beginning. And get the financing moving, but also we need leadership. President Ramaphosa in South Africa, took great leadership to do what he did on the Just Energy Transition Partnership.
So, Jonathan, I know you need to leave us in just a moment, but that key word that Jennifer just mentioned of partnerships is a perfect segue to get you to talk with us a little bit about the role that civil society and philanthropy can play in trying to address some of these issues, and particularly the question around climate emissions.
So thanks. And I think I don't have any real things to add. I think Jennifer's really laid out the pieces in both detail and with the appropriate frame. Maybe just to say a word finally about civil society and its role. At the end of the day, we collectively, it doesn't matter what kind of systems we've got, but we actually work jointly through our governments. That's the way we operate. That's the model through which we provide services and support and make decisions as a polity. We make them for global issues. We make them for national issues. We make them for local issues. Civil society is ultimately where this comes down to. What are you prepared to pay? What do you prioritize as an individual? What kinds of goods and services do you demand in your community? How will you pay for them? What kind of taxes are you prepared to incur? For what priorities will you pay those taxes? Those are in some cases through electoral politics, in some cases through street protests, in some cases through a process of choice in a rather different manner. But in all of those, it is the acquiescence and the agreement of the communities that are required to make change. Philanthropy plays an interesting role in that ecosystem. It's one of many partners. It provides some support for those who are looking to elevate agendas and issues. It provides information, capacity building, but ultimately it's about the civil society groups that do that work. And those are the people whose voices politicians listen to. Those are the people whose voices leaders listen to. I think what we're seeing is an increased level on two sides. The first one is the damages are becoming more apparent. People see them in their daily lives, and they're responding to those damages. The second is people see a set of solutions which look within reach, and they're looking for government to accelerate them, hence the pressure, hence bipartisan legislation in Europe or in the US or in Canada or in Australia or in Brazil. That comes because there's now cross-party, doesn't matter which parties, cross-party agreements on certain kinds of actions. Those then are driven no small measure by the perceptions of individuals, which is where things come out. I note that companies are a second point of contact. People actually have authority by what they purchase and what they demand of their companies. And companies in turn are responding, partly because they are facing risk, things like the risk assessments that are available for insurance companies, from banks. That changes a company's outlook, but also to the consumer, who's saying, what are you doing in my community or globally? I will or maybe won't buy your product because it doesn't align with my values and my vision. And those kinds of things are also showing up. Philanthropy is part of that ecosystem, but the ecosystem really is centered on people, on communities, and on choice.
Thank you. Jonathan, I really appreciate your joining us today. I'm sorry that you have to leave us, but I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
A great pleasure. Thanks so much. And Jennifer, great to see you. Steve, thanks so much for organizing this.
Jennifer, I know that your time is limited as well, but I'd love to ask you another question or two and possibly fold in a question from our viewers. You had talked a little bit about the holistic approach that needs to be taken when thinking about climate change, and certainly that's been something that we've seen in Germany's G7 approach to dealing with some of these challenges. At COP27, Germany actually launched something called the Global Shield Against Climate Risks Initiative. This initiative is designed to help low-income and vulnerable countries recover from climate disasters. Can you talk a little bit about what sort of precipitated this initiative and led up to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it follows nicely. As Jonathan was saying, you just see that people are realizing that the damages are much more apparent, and particularly vulnerable countries. I mean, small island nations, least developed countries that are being hit very hard by droughts, by floods, by a whole range of impacts, also loss of culture from sea level rise as it progresses. And therefore, there has been a call for more support to those vulnerable countries for the losses and damages that they're already suffering. And Germany wanted to respond to that, knowing we also were going to have a negotiation around that, but separate from it, so that we could move quickly. And so the Global Shield really is something that we put on, was led by our International Cooperation and Development Ministry. They put it onto the G7 agenda and worked with the V20, a vulnerable 20 group, to say, okay, what are the issues? And oftentimes what the issues are, there may be support, but it's highly complex to get it there. The transaction costs are massive. And so, imagine you've just been hit by another massive hurricane and you're supposed to figure out how to get support from where. So the approach really to respond to those problems that we heard from the most vulnerable countries was to create a mapping, to start with a group of pioneer countries that will map out what are the different scenarios for the impacts that could come, and where are the gaps in the support that they have. Mm-hmm. And then to match that with existing mechanisms. Could be insurance, it could be technical support, it could be supporting social systems, it could be looking at actual scientific partnering types of things, so that when a climate emergency or a climate-induced event occurs within 24 to 48 hours, there is a package that arrives that can support. Also, for example, delay of having to do debt payments for countries, which can be quite important. And so that was the kind of call that we had from our partners, and we worked with the V20 to launch it, and then launched it formally at the COP. In addition, we were very active in supporting the loss and damage negotiations, and so that there could be a real action solidarity. There, it's pretty clear that there's a lot to still be negotiated, that it will not only be developed country funding, it will not only be public funding, mm-hmm. But I think the types of floods that we saw in Pakistan, who was the chair of the G77 in China, we just felt a responsibility to respond.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as you sort of reflect on this year that's coming to a close and think about the future, what is your hope for what G7 countries can do moving forward to really help those vulnerable countries?
Well, I think, the first is to get this fund set up within a year. There's a transitional committee that's being formed to work in good faith to get that set up. I think that fund, really part of the decision was that it's part of a mosaic. It's part of a broader ecosystem. There are already different global funds, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, others, where we can be looking at what exists there now and what are the gaps and what could then be filled through those gaps. We have to fulfill the 100 billion goal. That is, from Copenhagen. We have committed to fulfill that by next year, and that is a big issue of trust with developing countries. But also, I think, whether it be mitigation, particularly mitigation and getting that moving, because the more you mitigate, the less you have to deal with losses and damages. So is really to work, and I was just as I mentioned, in South America, and met with industry and business there to get the framework conditions in place, the policies and the measures domestically to attract private finance. Mm-hmm. We are not where we need to be on that. It's a small number in comparison to what's needed. And so working with companies to get the frameworks in place so that they can have the long, loud legal signals to invest in renewable energy, to invest in green hydrogen, also to invest in some of the infrastructure that's climate resilient as well, I think is a big priority for 2023.
So as we start to come to a close, I have two questions. One that continues in the broad vein, and then one that focuses on Germany from one of our viewers. One thing that we haven't really talked about is supply chains, and I think that this is an area where we are obviously drawing some lessons from the pandemic and from the disruption that we experienced because of COVID-19. But I also know that having environmentally sustainable supply chains has been something that's been an important part of the sort of environmental and climate and sustainability piece of the G7 presidency. Can you talk a little bit about how, particularly a country like Germany is rethinking supply chains and sort of supply chain independence, if you will, in terms of production, and making sure that supply chains are indeed more sustainable moving forward?
Sure. I mean, I think there's so many different parts of the equation here. One is, within supply chains, looking at the risks that are there from climate impacts themselves, the disruption of supply chains, but then also the investments. What is one investing in the future, and the risk of fossil fuel stranded assets if one is investing in fossil fuels right now, because we know that we have little time to have global emissions. I think the way that Germany is thinking about it is we have a supply chain law now, and we're working, that's being finalized, also a version of it on the European level, but also on the European level, we're part of the discussions and finalization of a deforestation-free supply chain directive, because what we found is that our consumers want to do more, and they want to make sure that when they're buying products that they are being sourced based on good human rights law, that they're being sourced sustainably. And so I think a big part of the focus of how Germany and the European Union is doing that is to be setting out those standards on environment, on human rights, and then working in different countries to build capacity in order to fulfill those, but really creating the incentive for countries, say like a Brazil or others, that want to end their deforestation, go to zero, as incoming President Lula said. Well, let's create the market for those goods, and I think that's also a new way of having a partnership there. And I think we're also just quickly also looking, of course, we have a new geopolitics of energy, so we're also looking at where we supply our renewable energy sources from, working to diversify that. There's, Minister Habeck was just in Namibia with a large green hydrogen project that's moving there. And I can tell you that South American countries are very keen as well, that have massive renewable energy capacity, and also minerals that are required.
So that's actually a perfect segue to this closing question from one of our viewers, who's very curious about Germany's energy crisis. Of course, there's been a long discussion in Germany about the Energiewende, or the transition toward renewables, but our viewer is curious how one sort of reconciles this move toward renewables with an increased use of fossil fuels in the short term, and some of the commitments that are being asked of Germany when it comes to some of the fossil fuels, as Germany tries to reduce its dependency on Russia, but still has energy needs in the next few years that will not be met by renewables so quickly.
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, that's kind of what I started with. I mean, I think that as you replace Russian fossil fuels, all Russian fossil fuels by the end of the year, which is a massive amount of fossil fuels, number one, we're working to reduce the amount that we need. So that's where energy efficiency, which can happen very quickly, comes in. And I think feel fairly confident that we will peak our fossil fuel, our gas use, earlier than we would have before the Russian war of aggression, because of the measures we're being put in place. But what we're doing is working with Norway, working with the Netherlands, working with the US to secure adequate supply. Therefore, we have put in place LNG floating terminals. Those are all being done within a time frame that makes our 2045 binding greenhouse gas neutrality goal still possible. So I think that's very important, and also in a way that can be transitioned. Not all of it can be, but parts of it for green hydrogen imports over time. And the fossil fuel, the increase, for example, of coal use in the short term is a short term. Yeah, obviously it's a painful measure that we need to take, but we want to make sure that our citizens have heat through this winter and next. And therefore we've said, okay, we're taking a couple of plants out in putting them in reserves. And if we need them, we will use them. But we have binding greenhouse gas targets in Germany and the European Union. We have an emissions trading system, which means we will have to make that up. And we're committed to do that. We're sticking with our coal phase out goals and our greenhouse gas reduction goals, 65% by 2030 below 1990 levels. So we're working to accelerate that as much as possible, replace optimally with less gas, LNG, and in our infrastructure decisions, working very hard to make sure that they do not lock in long-term fossil fuel infrastructure, and then just putting in place some emergency measures to, as we said, I mean, our society, our people are, top priority. So need to get through this winter and next, which we're doing okay with.
Well, Special Envoy Jennifer Morgan, I want to thank you for your work that you do, because it is such an important work for all of us. I mean, certainly for Germany, but also globally, it is critical work that you're doing. So I want to thank you for that, but also on behalf of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. and the American Council on Germany, many, many thanks for taking the time at this very busy time and just coming off of a trip. We greatly appreciate having the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. Good to talk. These are important times to keep communication channels open, and certainly our transatlantic relationship is top.
It is indeed. So herzlichen Dank once more. Thank you very much. And I hope that our paths cross again in the not too distant future.
Ja, vielen Dank. Wiedersehen.